Hey there, how's it going today everyone? We have quite a bit to break down seeing as I'll be talking about two different trailers, but before I'll go into that, I actually have a bit of an update regarding Onimusha 3 HD Remaster. In an interview with JP Games, Capcom developers Satoru Nihei and Akihito Kadawaki have acknowledged that there is a fan demand for Onimusha 3 Remaster, however the company's focus is on Way of the Sword. It's important to note too that they didn't say that they weren't working on it or that there were no plans to do so, they just simply said that they can't focus on another project while they're working on Way of the Sword. So now it's really just a matter of waiting for an announcement from Capcom as to when we could expect that remaster in particular. I will admit though that I am a little disappointed to hear that it won't be coming out before Way of the Sword, simply because I was hoping to see if Capcom would retain the save data transfer unlocks from the original release of 3, but also include new additions like a Jubei Yagyu themed costume and a classic Samanosuke costume, considering that the HD remaster of Onimusha 2 introduced a new save data feature unlock. However, this might actually be a good thing assuming that Capcom expands on that feature specifically. Maybe we could get a brand new costume inspired by Musashi's Way of the Sword design in 3 and vice versa, an Onimusha 3 inspired costume at a later date for Way of the Sword. That's also likely going to be easy for them to implement because if Onimusha 2 HD is anything to go by, that game runs off of the RE engine, so I imagine it would be pretty easy for them to carry over assets between games assuming they don't have to recreate the costumes from the ground up, at least in Way of the Sword's case. There is another reason as to why this is a good thing. The only game that was mentioned in the statement was Onimusha 3, so this could mean one of two things. The first being the possibility of Onimusha Blade Warriors along with Dawn of Dreams and Tactics being included in one big major collection. Blade Warriors would be the only game that has to deal with the issue of using the likenesses of real life actors such as Takeshi Kaneshiro and Yusaku Matsuda. So considering that they released Onimusha 2 HD Remastered this year, depending on how the agreement works for the use of Yusaku Matsuda's likeness and even potentially Takeshi Kaneshiro's likeness, assuming they don't have to renew some contract or form up a new one to cover not just Onimusha 3 but also Blade Warriors, this could actually be to the fans' benefit. If they're able to get that sorted out, we could see Onimusha 3 release right alongside Blade Warriors, and as mentioned before, since Dawn of Dreams and Tactics don't feature the likenesses of famous Japanese actors, they might also be able to bundle those games together as well, or at the very least Dawn of Dreams could later then be released bundled with Tactics. However, the second possibility could just be that only 3 and Dawn of Dreams get remasters that either end up being sold individually or bundled together, leaving only Blade Warriors and Tactics to be remastered. Though I did speculate in a previous video that there was the possibility that Capcom may only want to remaster Onimusha 3 and possibly release both Blade Warriors and Dawn of Dreams on Sony's classic catalog for PlayStation 4 and 5, at which point it would only leave Onimusha Tactics as the only game that's least likely to be remastered due to the lack of fan demand for it. I've also stated that I wouldn't be a fan of that specifically because even for a game like Dawn of Dreams, despite not liking it, I'd still be willing enough to support it along with any other major release or re-release within the franchise because I simply don't want to see it die again. So my fingers are crossed that when Capcom finally announces the Onimusha 3 HD remaster, it ends up being the first scenario that I speculated about both here and in my previous video regarding this subject. Now then, I think I've dwelled on the subject for far too long, so let's get into the actual trailer breakdowns that I know you all are likely here for. Starting with the third trailer, we open up with the scene set in Dokyo's lab, which feels very reminiscent of the scene in Onimusha Warlords where you first encounter Guildenstern. We'll talk more about her specifically in a moment, but for now I just wanted to focus on what Dokyo says here. She says, "Where are my manners? Hello there, fallen samurai," and this is very important because it alludes to something that I've speculated before, which is the fact that the gauntlet keeps its respective user alive. We did also have this confirmed in the Gamescom demo that I was able to play back in August. Speaking of which, if you're interested in hearing my thoughts and impressions of that demo, feel free to check out that video by clicking on the iCard in the upper right corner, or by looking down in the description after you're done watching this video. To get back on track here, this is also something that the fourth trailer goes more in depth on, so I don't want to focus too much on this subject here because that trailer is more centered around that. Anyway, with this trailer in mind, we can see that Musashi is exploring the lab, and while he's exploring, we can hear the Oni Lady say, "To think, something like this was under the city the whole time." And before you ask, yes, that is what she's actually known as on the official website. The official website description of her reads as follows: "A female Oni housed in Musashi's Oni gauntlet. While she usually supports Musashi from within the gauntlet, she can also appear before him when the need arises. It's nice to see that we finally have a little more information to go on this time, but she's still somewhat of a mysterious character as of me recording this video. Moving on, we get a look at one of our first new Genma types called the Kogashira. It's described as a parasitic Genma that puppets a human host, enhanced by souls it has consumed. It releases malice which can bolster other Genma nearby. You can see in the design for this enemy type that they have large orange blisters on their head and even on their swords. Additionally, you can see what looks like insect-like hairs going all over their body. The trailer implies that they're quite a formidable foe to deal with, and we see them making heavy strikes, being relentless, and even being capable of overpowering Musashi. You can even hear the Oni Lady say, "What a fearsome power, be careful," so it'll be interesting to see how difficult these enemies will be to fight in the full game. Okay, so now we're back on Dokyo, and she says, "How righteous, and after everything you and your awful kind put him through too." Something that a friend of mine speculated is that she might be talking about Samanosuke here. However, I personally believe after reviewing this part of the trailer a few times that she's actually referring to Ganryu, otherwise known as Kojiro. The reason I believe that is because Kojiro being described as a psychotic character means that he could be holding some sort of resentment towards the Oni despite the fact that they've granted him power. I'll get back to that later since it might actually tie into some details seen in the fourth trailer. While we're on this frame of the third trailer, I do want to take the time to talk about Dokyo herself. The website has the following to say about her: an unusual entity that spends much of her time in her laboratory under the capital, engrossed in creating new Genma variants. One glimpse at the facility's eerie nature is enough to make clear her twisted tastes. As mentioned before, the encounter with Dokyo is very much similar to Guildenstern's in Onimusha Warlords in that regard, because we get a look at a brand new enemy type immediately afterwards, and she has the following to say: "Were you feeling left out? Here, let me show you something to cheer you up." This new enemy type is known as Chijiko, and it's very similar to Reynaldo from Onimusha Warlords, where attacking the enemy will cause it to split into two and spawn more Chijiko, as seen in the trailer. Chijiko is described as a Genma created by Dokyo, a grotesque mass of stitched together faces and tentacles. I'm really curious as to what the best way to deal with these enemies is going to be, because based on the footage, it seems as though standard attacks will be borderline useless against them. On a side note, I am really curious to know if we'll be seeing any sort of powerful Oni turned Genma as a result of Dokyo's experiments, similar to Marcellus, since this trailer alone plays a lot on Onimusha Warlords nostalgia with all the nods and similarities throughout it. Anyway, I don't want to focus too much on this portion since there isn't much to take away from it, but in the next few shots there's actually quite a bit to go over. So we first see Musashi fighting some more Kogashira, and at least some enemies that resemble them. These might actually be the enemies that the Kogashira actually bolster. It's nice to see that these enemies seemingly have the most variety in their design. Another thing that I've noticed is that we also get to see Musashi using a bow alongside a new Oni weapon. The Oni Bow, as of current, is the only projectile-based weapon that Musashi will have available to him. The website has the following to say about the bow: "Launches an arrow forwards into the distance. Holding down the button will charge your shots, causing them to deal more damage." So this is the first time that a bow in the series can be charged to deal more damage. However, we still don't know if there's going to be other arrow types similar to Onimusha 3, or if there'll be other projectile-based weapons like matchlock rifles seen in previous entries. Personally, I am hoping that a matchlock rifle is added to the game, because while I do like the variety in arrow types as seen in Onimusha 3, I also think that it would be nice to have multiple projectile-based options if possible. Although maybe they could address the arrow types by having the charge shot deal elemental damage based on the Oni weapon that's equipped at any given moment, even if that's the only projectile-based weapon that Musashi will have available to him. Now, the Oni weapon that was shown off is pretty exciting, because not only do we know that it's a wind-based weapon, but we've also gotten the names of all of the Oni weapons that they've shown off so far. So before I talk about the new weapon, I just want to go in the order of what the weapons are called based on their reveal order, so we'll save the new weapon for last. This first weapon is called the Two Celestials, and it has the following to say about them. Issues a flurry of attacks with a pair of deadly blades. Enemies hit by this ability will release yellow souls, which Musashi can absorb to recover health, making them a great means of dealing damage and increasing survivability. This is also the only weapon in this game, as of me recording this video, that is solely meant to drain yellow souls from enemies. We've seen this weapon the most throughout the trailer, so there's not much new to talk about here. Now, the only weapon we haven't seen too much of since its reveal is the Earthshakers. I'm actually amazed at the fact that I predicted that this is an earth-based weapon in my second trailer breakdown. The website describes the weapon as hammers with the power to rend the very fabric of space. They can tear through enemies' stamina, shields, and armor alike. charging up the attack makes them hit even harder. Based on the description of this weapon, it seems like certain weapons will have the ability to be charged up to deal more damage. I just hope that all of the weapons in the game have the potential to do so, but honestly I won't be surprised if it's strictly tied to the Earthshakers. We haven't seen too much of this weapon, but hopefully by the time Capcom releases the 5th trailer, we'll see it more in action. Lastly, we have our most recently revealed weapon, the Wind Whipper. This weapon functions very similar to Shippu and Senpumaru from Onimusha Warlords and Onimusha 2 Samurai's Destiny, where it creates a whirlwind or small tornado to deal an AoE magic attack. You may notice that the website description is fairly similar to how I described the weapon, but it also points out a few additional details that I did not point out. Whirl a double-bladed naginata overhead that stirs up a whirlwind that can hit enemies over a wide area. Enemies within range will be sent flying, and any incoming ranged attacks that enter the vortex will be negated. If the whirlwind comes in contact with a flame, it will transform into a scorching cyclone. So despite this weapon sharing similarities to the weapons from past entries, it does have one key feature that makes it stand out in that it can deal more damage when in contact with fire. I'm looking forward to using this weapon the most since it's looking to potentially be the best wind-based weapon in the entire series. Now, I still think it would be cool if Musashi could get weapons that are in reference to the Book of Five Rings in terms of the elements, but so far we only have 2 of the elements that are referenced in that book, those being Earth and Wind, unless Void is supposed to be represented by Light with the 2 Celestials. However, I'm a little doubtful that the elements for the weapons will be featured that way, since it does seem like they're introducing weapons with the same or similar elements to the weapons found in Onimusha 3. Also, just a small little nitpick, I would have preferred if the naming scheme for the weapons was similar to the old games, but it's not the biggest deal in the world. Anyway, to get back on track, we're also introduced to a new Genma boss that some of you might be familiar with if you've played the Neo series called the Greater Nue. Greater Nue is a Genma created by Dokyo. It assaults its prey with feral, agile attacks and strikes of lightning. What I find interesting about the design is that it has these 3 kabuki-styled masks on its head, and I'm curious if a break Issen will cause them to be destroyed, similar to Kojiro's Iron Kasa during his boss fight. Speaking of boss fights, we do get to see a little bit of this fight play out, with Musashi parrying an attack from Nue and also seemingly performing a finisher or break Issen. Something that I'd also like to point out here too is that you can see some water throughout the boss arena, and considering the fact that in the trailer the Oni Lady specifically states that the Nue is controlling the lightning, I wouldn't be surprised if standing in the water would cause it to target you with the lightning to deal massive amounts of damage if you get into direct contact with it. Hopefully we can see some footage of this boss fight soon, or maybe potentially face it in a demo, which is something that I do want to talk about towards the end of this video. Anyway, before this trailer ends, we hear Musashi shouting, "I don't have time for these stupid games," likely at Dokyo, who replies with, "I'm terribly sorry, anyway do enjoy," referring to the Chijiko from earlier in the trailer before running off. We do also have this final shot of Musashi standing under what looks like a trap within Dokyo's lab that has spinning blades on it, and I'm not sure what the significance is of that, but it does look like something you're supposed to destroy, but there's a chance that I might be misinterpreting it, and it could just be a lift that's activated when using the Wind Whipper's magic attack, similar to the lifts in Onimusha 2 that needed Senpumaru's magic attack to be activated. And that's all we have for the 3rd trailer, but we're not done here just yet because we still have the 4th trailer to go over as well. Now, the 4th trailer is something that I'm super excited to talk about because even though it's mostly focused on the story, we have another returning character plus a new character who also has an Oni gauntlet, which I featured for this video's thumbnail. However, before we get into talking about those characters, I want to talk about how the 4th trailer actually opens up. We see that Musashi asks, "Am I dead?" and we can see that he is in chest-deep water or possibly blood, and we can see 2 things in the background. The first thing is a raging fire out in the distance, possibly implying that Musashi is in hell, or at the very least in the underworld. The second thing is we can see a figure standing behind him dressed in a white kimono with feathers. We can hear the figure respond by saying, "Oh yes, so this gauntlet is for you. You pop this on, you get the power of the Oni, and you'll be back topside." And while this is being said, we can see what happened to Musashi, and it seems like during the scene where he's challenged by the various samurai or ronin, Genma appear and start slaughtering everyone, including Musashi, who we can see has cuts around his arms and chest. I've speculated for a while now that the Oni gauntlets in this game keep their respective users alive, and that was more or less confirmed with the Gamescom demo, which I did talk about in my previous video, which again you can check out in the description or the top right corner where the iCard is if you haven't haven't seen it already. Anyway, this scene more or less confirms that theory more so than the dialogue ever did, which I'm pretty excited to see. What this scene also does is debunk another theory I had about this potentially being Samanosuke's gauntlet originally, which in fairness I do believe would have made sense given that Samanosuke, now under the alias of Tenkai, would have likely been willing enough to entrust the gauntlet to Musashi, but I don't want to dwell too much on what ifs. What I do want to focus on is the fact that unlike the gauntlet Samanosuke and Jacques received, it seems like Musashi's gauntlet isn't formed on him via a magical fire like the previous entries. Instead, it's ready for him to wear, at least based on the way that the trailer is shot and edited. We can also hear Musashi say, "I walk the path of the sword with my strength alone. I don't need some monstrous power." Of course, we know that he does end up wearing the gauntlet, but what we don't know is what convinced him to do so, and my guess is that it might have something to do with Kojiro Sasaki, considering that he also likely had the same fate as Musashi, albeit under different circumstances. Immediately after, we do get to see a brand new character that some of you may be familiar with if you've played the Neo series, with an Oni gauntlet known as Ono no Takamura. Now, I'm really excited to talk about this character because there's a lot of mystery surrounding them. If this is supposed to be the historical figure of the same name, then that would make him the oldest human character in the series, since Ono no Takamura was born in 802 AD, and Way of the Sword is likely taking place in 1612 before Musashi defeats Kojiro, which would mean that Ono is over 800 years old. The historical figure is tied to various stories and legends, with one in particular mentioning that every night he'd climb down a well that would lead to hell to join the deity Yama in order to assist him with judgments. I get the feeling that in Way of the Sword he's going to play a major role, not just helping Musashi get to the underworld to defeat the Genma, but also in defeating Kojiro once and for all. We'll talk a little more about that later on, but in the meantime, I did want to focus on the description for Ono that's on the website. An individual that Musashi comes to meet through the guidance of the voice in his gauntlet. A highly skilled swordsman, he can vanquish Genma with ease despite his old age. He appears to have an Oni gauntlet, much like Musashi and Ganryu. Even the description mentions that he's quite old, even though they don't outright say his age, and I'm really curious to know how old he really is. I also want to take a moment to focus on his gauntlet design. Longtime Onimusha fans may have noticed this really distinctive detail about his gauntlet, specifically regarding the color of it. Ono's gauntlet is primarily bronze with some gold coloration in the mix, and the dragon orb within the gauntlet is yellow. There was one other character who had a gauntlet almost identical to his, that being Jean Reno's character in Onimusha 3, Jacques Blanc. Of course, Jacques' gauntlet in his official render had a cyan blue dragon orb, however the in-game model is much like Ono's, where it's a light yellow color. I'm not sure if this was done intentionally as a reference or some kind of new detail to the lore that ties Onimusha 3 to Way of the Sword, or just some design choice that happened out of sheer coincidence. In any case, I thought it was a pretty neat detail, and I wonder if Capcom would consider giving Jacques an alternate costume based on Ono in Onimusha 3 HD when the time comes for that game. There's another thing that I'm really curious about, and I'm hoping this will turn out to be the case, is if we'll be able to play as Ono in some way. I mentioned this in my previous trailer breakdown when talking about Kojiro, because throughout the series it has been a standard to play as more than one character, and I was really hoping that would be the case with Ono as well. Just thinking about the potential of having all three of these characters be playable is pretty exciting. So if he does end up becoming playable, I wonder how his gameplay could potentially differ from Musashi's and Kojiro's, especially if he has his own unique set of Oni weapons that would be available to him. One last thing that I'd like to talk about regarding this character before we move on is that, as mentioned earlier, he's described as a highly skilled swordsman, and considering that Musashi doesn't want to rely on Oni powers to defeat the Genma, I wonder if Ono will teach Musashi some skills throughout the game. After all, being around for over 800 years, he'd likely know some skills or abilities that could be beneficial to Musashi's quest. We'll talk a little more about Ono in some later portions of the trailer, but for now, I want to take a moment to focus on another returning character, Izumo no Okuni, who I'll simply be referring to as Okuni throughout the video. Okuni's first appearance in the series was as a party member in Onimusha Tactics, the tactical RPG spin-off within the series, and she was later seen in the Dawn of Dreams manga, as well as being featured in Onimusha Soul. Now, before I get into talking about the character in a little more depth, I did want to point out that when we first see Ono appear in the trailer, there is a single frame in the trailer that's really easy to miss because it goes by so fast, where you can actually see her standing by wielding a tanto watching Ono fight just before we get a closer look at the character herself. Here in this closer shot, we can see the tanto she's wielding is covered in blood, but the really interesting thing about that is the blade itself. It's this green or jade color, and it doesn't seem to resemble the swords that any of the other characters have been seen wielding throughout the game so far. It's very reminiscent of Kaede's sacred knife from Onimusha Onimusha warlords. Maybe it shares the same origins as the sacred knife, as in it might be a weapon that was forged by the Oni a long time ago. Also, it's very ironic that Okuni has a similar color scheme to Kaede in this game as well, so perhaps there might be some similarities in terms of characterization between this iteration of Okuni and Kaede. Before I continue with the trailer itself, let's go over the character description on the website. A young dancer who, due to certain circumstances, comes to Ono no Takamura seeking the power to defeat the Genma. While her kabuki dances brought her fame within the city, other priorities are keeping her from the stage of late. So based on her character description, we know that she's aware of who Ono is. However, they're being vague about exactly the circumstances that led her to search for him. I'm really curious about why she specifically decided to search for Ono and not Samanosuke, who would otherwise be known as Tenkai at this point in the lore. I'll talk a little bit more about Samanosuke in a moment, but I assume it likely has something to do with the fact that Ono is a swordsman, whereas Tenkai, to someone unaware, is simply a Buddhist priest not capable of dealing with the Genma, but that's only the case if her depiction in the Dawn of Dreams manga is considered to be non-canon. The problem is that we know Okuni wasn't aware of Musashi or any other warrior possessing an Oni gauntlet, seeing as how she was surprised by the fact that Musashi has a gauntlet as well, which interestingly enough, she does seem to know what an Oni gauntlet is, so that leaves us with a few possibilities here. The first being that the circumstances that cause her to be in search of Ono could possibly have something to do with Tenkai as well as her friend Jubei Kane Yagyu. After all, the ending of Dawn of Dreams has both Tenkai and Jubei set out on different journeys, which could explain the absence of these characters in this game, and perhaps Ono or even Musashi are the only ones capable of helping them. However, if we assume that Dawn of Dreams has been retconned, or at the very least the lore surrounding it has been, which Capcom has done with other games in the past, then it's possible that this is just supposed to be a fresh start for this character, and they just wanted to make her already aware of the Oni for some reason that'll either be explained through the story or through the files. There is one other possibility, although I see this one being very unlikely, is that this isn't the same Okuni from the Dawn of Dreams manga, and what I mean by that is that it could just be a new character that happened to take on the name of Okuni, similar to how Akane takes on the name of Jubei Yagyu. Even Okuni in the manga didn't go by that name originally, instead her original name was Hinagiku. Whatever the case may be, I do hope that we'll get some answers about Okuni, even if they're not concrete or directly pointing to anything that I've speculated about here on this video. Going a little bit backwards here, I'm not sure if this first voice is from Okuni that mentions the power of the gauntlet sustaining Musashi's life, but I'm just going to assume that it's from the Oni Lady saying that because it's a little hard to tell in my opinion who it actually is, and I think it's more likely that the Oni Lady is saying this rather than Okuni. But let me know down in the comment section below who you might think the voice belongs to. It's also nice to see that part of my theory from previous videos has been confirmed and reiterated here. Anyway, the trailer cuts to Kojiro, which isn't really new since we've already seen this footage from the second trailer, plus the gameplay footage that came from Gamescom. The thing I do want to focus on here is actually the music that plays in the trailer. I don't know if it's just me, but it really sounds similar to Samanosuke's theme in Onimusha Warlords HD, not to be confused by the theme featured in the original and Genma release of the first game. Just for comparison's sake, listen to Samanosuke's theme and then listen to this trailer focusing solely on the music in this portion of it, and don't worry, we'll talk about the new footage that's shown in just a moment here.
This thing's made me so damn strong.
Musashi, I cannot apologize enough for dragging you down this path against your will.
If I take this gauntlet off, I'll be a bloody mess on the floor anyway.
This isn't what you promised, Gauntlet.
My troop was attacked, and one of our members is missing. Save this world.
Fighting Genma wasn't the path I'd planned, but who knows? Maybe it'll be worth my while.
It could just be that it's the same composer, so they decided to make a track that's very similar from that remaster for this game specifically as a theme for Musashi, or it could possibly be a new rendition of Samanosuke's theme if he's going to be in this game, which as of current there isn't any evidence of that being the case, but there's always the possibility that he can return. To get back on track here, we have a scene of the Oni Lady pleading with Musashi to help the Oni, where she even goes on to apologize to Musashi, who we already know is very adamantly against using the power of the Oni gauntlet for strength. Musashi responds by saying that if he were to take off the gauntlet now, he'd be a bloody mess on the floor anyway. We do get to see some gameplay, which seemingly does look much faster in my opinion, at least in comparison to the Gamescom build of the game that I got to play, so I'm glad that it seems like Capcom has taken some criticism into account here. I'll get into the gameplay from this part in just a moment, because there's a little more that gets shown off a little after some of the additional story scenes. Here are some of those cutscenes in question, although keep in mind that these are all taken out of context, and I don't have much to speculate on here, but we'll go over them just briefly before talking about the gameplay. First, we see Kojiro being angry with his gauntlet, presumably at the Oni that's housed within his gauntlet about some kind of promise not being kept. Next, we have Okuni walking with Musashi and the Oni Lady saying that her troop was attacked and missing a member. This might be the reason why Okuni is searching for Ono, which does contradict some of my theories about her, but this scene is taken out of context, so take it with a grain of salt. It then shows us the Oni Lady pleading with Musashi to save this world, and this is where we get to see the only other portion of gameplay where Musashi says fighting the Genma wasn't the path that he planned, but it might be worth his while. This is where I want to take the time to focus on the gameplay we've been shown so far. So mostly what we're seeing is Musashi's ability to perform Issens and evasions, which, as mentioned before, looks much faster than the Gamescom build. It also seems like they brought back the screen flashes from Issen attacks, because every Issen he does in this trailer not only has his sword flashing like we've seen in previous trailers, but also the traditional screen flash that classic fans such as myself are used to seeing. In my previous videos, I assumed that they removed it due to the flash potentially harming players who may suffer from epilepsy. However, they might be giving players the option to turn it off for that very reason, and for players who don't suffer from that or just want to have the game feel a little closer to the old games, they have that option available to them. There also seems to be a lot of enemies on screen, and while that's not new for the series, it is nice to see that this game is keeping that tradition, although I do wonder if we'll be seeing Onimusha 3 levels of enemy density. I'm also curious if there's going to be the possibility of seeing a mode similar to Devil May Cry's legendary Dark Knight mode, which essentially has hordes of enemies to deal with per mission. I wouldn't mind seeing something like that for Onimusha just for fun more than anything. Speaking of enemies, I nearly forgot to mention that we get to see more of an enemy we've already seen in some recent gameplay, however we didn't have a name for them before. These are the Togemaru. They are extremely similar to Bazu and Dora Bazu from previous entries. On the website it describes them as a Genma with large spikes running down its back. They charge forward, spinning or rolling at great speeds to shred anyone unfortunate enough to remain in their path. Their attack animations are very similar to those past enemies, so I'd argue that they're very much like Daidara, where despite the fact of sharing those similarities to those past enemies, they share no relation whatsoever. And then we get to the most interesting part of the gameplay, this unique attack animation that looks like a charge attack and deals one large slash to the enemies within range, killing them instantly. What's really cool about this is that we can see the armor materialize onto Musashi, and it's a little hard to tell because of how far back the camera is, but it looks like his hands change from being human to Oni. I don't think that has anything to do with the costumes that director Nihei talked about in his previous interviews though. Instead, I think what we're looking at is our new charge attack, which might have a little more mechanical depth behind it this time around. I think each weapon that Musashi will acquire will have the ability to alter the charge attack based on the element it's associated with, because if you notice, the attack is a bright yellow slash, almost as if Musashi is drawing the power from the two celestials into this move, considering the fact that the weapon is yellow and has the power of light. That makes me wonder if Musashi will gain alternate attack animations based on the charge attack he uses with each weapon. Also, another thing that has me curious is the armor that's materializing on him. Does that change based on the Oni weapon that he has equipped at any given moment, or is it always the same, and is it a glimpse of his Oni form? This is something that I hope that they go into more depth on in the next trailer, which is probably going to be at the Game Awards, which I'll talk a little more about later. The gameplay finishes off with a really awesome looking chain Issen, and I'm really liking the look of it, but I'm also curious to know if we can control which enemies Musashi attacks in said chain. The other thing that I'd like to know is if there's a cap on how many enemies can be killed within chain Issens. I'm really hoping that we'll get a demo to play at home soon, because overall the gameplay keeps looking better and better, and a demo would just give us the chance to be able to experiment with stuff like this and give additional feedback to Capcom before launch. To get back to the trailer though, Ono responds to Musashi with the words "well said" before giving a big hearty laugh, and then we see the trailer cut to a giant door that Ono is standing in front of. Something that I immediately took notice of in this shot is the artwork depicting various humans and demons. The demons shown in the artwork range from Oni to Ushi Oni, which is a type of yokai that has features of both man and ox or another beast, and I believe that the artwork that we're seeing on the door here is a depiction of the Genma similar to their depiction from the artwork and notes from Saimyo in Onimusha Warlords, where we see what the Genma do on a regular basis when left unchecked. Keep in mind though that in Japanese mythology, some demons, despite generally being viewed as evil in some cases like the Oni, are worshipped as divine beings to ward off evil spirits, which generally speaking is how the series portrays Oni specifically, as benevolent creatures who love humans. So my guess is that this artwork is intentionally misleading, or artwork that depicts corrupted Oni that happen to be evil because of what the Genma have done to them in the past. There's two parts of this artwork that I'd like to take a moment to focus on, the first being the upper left corner where it looks like we can see some kind of noble or official with a hammer offering a human sacrifice, which is something that is mentioned in Onimusha 2's notes about humans giving sacrifices to the demons while they provided humans with science and technology. Of course, there's also the note about the dark ritual in Onimusha Warlords from Guildenstern, which makes mention of needing a woman of pure blood from the land that the contracted human is from, because if we look at the center and right of the doors, we can see some women in the fields being attacked by a demon, and at the very right, they're showing what looks like an urn containing some human blood. Though, if we go off of Saimyo's notes, that might not actually be the dark ritual, but instead the Genma birthing ritual, which required a mix of human blood with evil essence. Also, I have to ask where this door actually leads, because when I first saw this trailer, I assumed that this might be how we enter the Phantom Realm for the first time, but after looking at the door more carefully and giving some thought, I think this might actually be the Gate of Hell. In which case, it would make more sense why Ono is standing in front of it, perhaps as potentially being a guardian or gatekeeper similar to Gozu and Mezu, two Japanese Oni in folklore that are typically associated with being the gatekeepers of hell. Maybe in this case here, Ono's assisting Yama with the judgment of Musashi, but this could also be how we get to that parallel world that we saw in the second trailer that was in hell, at least according to Musashi. After we see Musashi's shocked expression of the door, we can see him crossing swords with Kojiro again at Kiyomizu-dera Temple, where he shouts to him, "Get a hold of yourself, are you a man or a beast?" And this is likely after the boss fight where we might see Kojiro be revived in real time during this cutscene. Next, we see Musashi saying to Okuni that getting strong because of some gauntlet, that's not strength. And we don't know the exact location of where they are in Kyoto, but this trailer really wants to emphasize how much Musashi hates having to use the gauntlet. After that, we have a new shot of Daidara saying, "I'm going to eat all of the souls you got in there," which I thought was a little interesting because I thought he was only hungry for humans, but it seems that he'll eat just about anything. Then we have a shot of Musashi in the mud looking up to Okuni, who says, "Turns out Miyamoto Musashi was just a brute with the sword after all." It seems like Okuni is being doubtful of Musashi as a warrior, but this scene could be taken out of context, possibly having something to do with Ono and the door that we saw earlier, but it's a little too early to tell. After that, we have Ono saying to Musashi, "Being tough isn't enough. A warrior meditates on what strength really means." And what I think Ono is trying to get at here with Musashi is that he's being cocky, which might line up with what Okuni is talking about, or even the insult that Kojiro threw his way about being a coward who runs away from duels. Personally, this sort of irks me though, because the real life historical figure wasn't just some brute with a sword or a coward, unless the story is meant to show that the other characters view Musashi in this way, or could just simply be a creative liberty to tell the story, even though this specific aspect would be historically inaccurate. Although to be fair in Ono's case, since he's been around for so long, I could at least understand that coming from him, because he's literally got hundreds of years worth of experience, whereas Musashi at this point would only have about 15 years worth of experience. After we hear Ono speaking, we hear a new voice saying, "Enjoying your new toys, I see."
Enjoying your new toys, I see.
This might be the voice of the Oni within Kojiro's gauntlet, since we know that he was speaking with them before, but we've never actually physically seen them present. My only other guess would be that this could be a new Genma we haven't been introduced to yet, but we'll have to wait and see how this one plays out in the future. Lastly, we see a white soul being absorbed by Kojiro's gauntlet, which looks lifeless, with the dragon orb within being shrouded in darkness before it lights up again, seemingly being reawakened. I want to take the moment to speculate what the white souls could actually be in this case. Throughout the series, we've had various various soul types are standard red, yellow, and blue for upgrades, health, and magic, although in this game's case, blue is now used for special abilities and not so much for magic attacks. We've also had green souls, which could enhance Genma, but could also temporarily grant invincibility and health regen, purple souls, which could tap into the main character's pseudo-Oni forms, or in the case of Dawn of Dreams, tap into special abilities. Also, we have the dark souls, or the darkness that the statues at Notre Dame and Nobunaga's sword were shrouded with, which served to no gameplay purpose, but was an evil essence that could be purified with the gauntlet to obtain Kuga and Nobunaga's purified sword. Additionally, Onimusha 3 had the rainbow-colored souls that only appeared in the final battle of the game and replaced the purple souls. Those simply granted Samanosuke the ability to deal more damage to Nobunaga. Lastly, we have the black souls, which were introduced in Way of the Sword, and these are more story-driven as they show fragments of past events. So what could the white soul possibly be, and does it serve any gameplay purpose? Well, I'm willing to bet that the white soul is simply a human soul and won't serve any gameplay function and won't actually be seen in gameplay. Instead, it'll be something that'll only be seen within cutscenes to show us if characters like Kojiro are dead. Although it could also be an Oni soul color, since we can see that Kojiro is standing up, and perhaps his gauntlet's dragon orb not lighting up as usual means that the Oni within was dead up until the point that the soul was absorbed. However, we do see several human corpses, so I'm thinking this is likely going to be a human soul that Kojiro is absorbing, to which Musashi calls out to him, likely challenging him to put an end to the bloodshed that Kojiro has caused. Hey there, Future Dom here. I just wanted to point out that I actually overlooked the fact that in Onimusha Warlords there were white souls that allowed you to interact with the dead. Now, I have no idea if the white souls in Onimusha Way of the Sword will serve the same gameplay purpose, because they're likely going to change it in some way, shape, or form, but I just wanted to point that out. Also, I love how Kojiro just looks back at him and says, "Hey, Musashi," because it sounds a lot like the gatekeeper Minogoro whenever he would offer to take Samanosuke or Jacques to the Dark Realm. For comparison's sake, just take a listen here.
Hey, do not be afraid. I have information that may help. Hey, won't you go to the Dark Realm? There is no guarantee you will live, but if you do, great rewards await you. I hope you come back alive. Shall we go?
Hello? Oh. 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 Hey! That gauntlet!
So, you've been to the Dark Realm, haven't you? Hey! Are you ready to go so soon? At the very bottom, there should be a nice treat. I guess you already know this, but you might not make it back alive. You're going anyway?
Hey, Musashi.
First it was the similar faces with Goken Dantes, and now this, and I feel like Capcom is just having a lot of fun writing Kojiro, and that's probably going to make him the best character in the game. But to get back on track here, there is also the possibility that Dokyo's comment about everything awful the Oni put someone through has some connection to what is happening here in this scene with Kojiro. Perhaps dying on several occasions, or even transforming into a full-on Oni has some negative consequences that we're just not fully aware of. Really, the only thing that I can think of is losing your humanity, which isn't necessarily new to the series, but there might be more to it than that, such as possibly becoming psychotic if you've died several times. And with that, we have gone through 2 Onimusha trailers for this video. However, before we wrap up, I did say that I wanted to talk a little bit about the Game Awards here. No, I will not be attending the Game Awards like I did with Gamescom this year. However, I did want to bring up the fact that the game was announced there last year, so I wanted to speculate what we could expect regarding this game at the show. I think we can expect the new trailer with the release date for the game, the announcement of pre-orders trailers and additions that the game will be releasing with, as well as a demo to play at home, since producer Katawaki, along with the rest of the development team, wanting to see as many people as possible get the chance to play the game, since they believe that the trailers can only do so much to convey the overall experience. Even if a demo isn't announced at the Game Awards, I could see Capcom saving it for when they do their next big Capcom showcase, talking about all their current and upcoming releases. They do have the tendency to show off a little more information than they would have otherwise at some of these major events and showcases, so it's not out of the realm of possibilities here. That in on itself is really exciting to think about, since I've said in my initial video on this game, 20 years will have passed since the last Onimusha game released, so I'm more excited than ever to see what Capcom has in store for us in the near future. And with that, I'd love to know what you all thought of today's video. What are your thoughts on these recent trailers, and are you expecting any big news from Capcom in the foreseeable future like I am? Let me know down in the comment section below, and if you liked today's video, feel free to give it a like, share it, and maybe even consider subscribing. And until then, I will see you all in the next one. Matane!